So Made for More, a study on purpose. Just 5 weeks where we're in week 3, so we're halfway through. We're just exploring this idea of gifting, what it means, why we have it, what usefulness is it. And I hope if you're just joining us for the first time, so if it's your first Sunday here, you're jumping right into the middle, and we'll recap a little bit. If you've been with us through the whole thing, we'll talk about kind of where the outcome of this is heading and what we can hope for with each other in community, because we've walked through, I wanted something like edgy and memorable and remarkable, but this just really seems to capture what we're talking about. And it's this idea, everyone is a gift. Week 1, we just kind of started out by saying everyone is a gift, and here's how we want to talk about gifts. This is really not about you. It's actually about a God who loves you. A father, a creator, a maker who sees you and who puts the language I would use and the language of Scripture uses, you're made in the image of this God. And because of that reality, which is a universal reality that all people share, because of that, everyone is a gift. Because if you have qualities and attributes that reflect those of God, then you are and you should be a gift. So we started here week 1, everyone is a gift. And then week 2, last week, Katie got up and she just shared the second part. Everyone is a gift with gifts. It's not only about position, internal value because I'm made in the image of God. It's also that you have something, and the key this week, you have something to share. Everyone is a gift with gifts to share. And so the main idea in the conversation today would really be sharing is caring. I just hold that in your mind. I want you to walk away with that idea because it's true. And it's true on a deep human level. Sharing is caring. And so one of the things when we explore today that everyone is a gift with gifts to share is we kind of put a tool out to help you explore gifts. Now, if you've lived a few decades, you're probably familiar with a variety of tools to look at teamwork and strengths, whether it's Strength Finders or it's the Enneagram, or whether it's Myers-Briggs. It's kind of the original one a lot of us dropped into, or the 4 Voices, or there's so many different tools out there. You also, if you've been in the church, have taken a variety of inventories to figure out what your spiritual gifts are. Because we talk about in the church that somehow we have gifts, and these things have always driven me nuts because I'm like, okay, so God's like, here's some gifts, but you got to take a bunch of tests to find out what they are. Just seems a little bit overcomplicated. So just be open-handed with this with me. I'd love for you to go at some point in the next couple days, go to everygift.com. You can scan that QR code right in front of you on the chairs, takes you to eastern.life, and just take this inventory. And when you take it, it's not the end all. It's certainly not the most agreeable. It's just one that helps you think. And you throw the code Eastwind in there, it helps us think as a community. Because what you'll find is every gift breaks down gifts in kind of interesting buckets, things that might seem more actionable for our day-to-day life. Technical gifts, interpersonal gifts, civic gifts, like I get motivated and lit up by going and doing good for my city, being involved in nonprofit organizations and helping those. Maybe it's communication or financial. Maybe you're just like the budget person. And everybody comes to you and you're always pulling your hair out going, oh, if people would just follow these principles. You feel particularly gifted in these. So when you take the every gift inventory, it'll spit out a few things that it says these are more likely than not things that motivate you, contributions you make. These are not just like work skills. I would say these are divine. These have connection to how you are made, the image God has put on you, and how we work together to flourish in common. So I'm going to give you a second to self-assess. Okay, now when you're self-assessing, you might go, but I need explanations of what all these are. Well, maybe your gift is critical thinking then. You're like, I need some stuff to dig into here. Or if you look at one of these, you're like, I don't know what technical is. You're probably not gifted in these areas. So take a minute, turn to the person next to you. If you don't know them, introduce yourself, and then just boldly say, when I look at that list, I feel like I just really learn from other cultures and love connecting in spaces where things are different than what I know. Or so maybe it's intercultural, or maybe you're like, I love creating and producing something. Doesn't matter what the medium is. So take a minute, turn to the person next to you. It's kind of like a brag session. So you get 60 seconds, get your brag on, do it boldly, and then we'll come back. All right, so go ahead. Was that me that popped? Okay. I know
try sometimes. You just might find you get what you need.
All right, take like 10 seconds.
Oh yeah. You get what you need.
So, a couple pointers. One, during that break, Leif ran up and started trying to fix my mic. Technical gifts, how wonderful. I also, if you sat next to somebody that like the whole minute they talked and they basically said, well, all these are my gifts. You don't even have to know them. You can put your hand right on their arm and say, honey, you just need to listen for the next few minutes, okay? Because we have certain things. The ideal here is not to like complete the pie and every slice is you. It's to consider, what is God doing in and through me? And what's my vocation and my education, my passions and my hobbies and my interests and my experiences? How have they shaped me that in ways that I'm gonna call these things gifts that they might earn me a paycheck? They might, create a lot of life-giving experience for me. I mean, we're not putting any box on those things. We just want you to, I want you to have one before I go on. Just one of these. Just grab hold of it like this is, and test it for the next few minutes. We're going to look at some scriptures about how the church was formed, and we're going to explore like the question I really want to explore is going to be this: what do you think your gifts are for? And in weird fashion, we're going to do back-to-back turn and talk to each other. I got my every gift inventory here, and I printed it out, and it was interesting. So my primary gift, it said, is communication, and my secondary gift is leadership. But what's really interesting was the challenge that it said to me was, are you coaching and mentoring and encouraging other people with these gifts, or are you just using them for like you? And I thought that was really, really interesting to think about. Like, what's the purpose of my gifts? What are they for? And I don't know if you have put thought before into the idea. Gifts we can think about, but the why is a pretty big deal. Why do you have gifts? Is it just because you needed to know how to fix the faucet? And why don't other people have that gift? Is it just because you can present information to people in a way that they can learn it? Is it just because? So I want you to turn to your neighbor again. I want you to, elevator pitch. You got 1 minute, you get on an elevator, stranger gets on, right? And they look at you and they go, why do I have gifts? What are you going to tell them in that 1 minute? They're asking you, and it matters. You get 60 seconds. How would you answer this question? What do you think your gifts are for? And then we'll take a break from questions for a bit. All right, go ahead.
Well, I won't back down. No, I won't back down. You can stand me up at the gates of hell, but I won't back down. No, I'll stand my ground. I won't be turned around. And I keep this world from dragging me down. Gonna stand my ground. And I won't back down. Hey, baby, there ain't no easy way out. Hey, I will stand my ground. And
All right, you got it? You answered the question, right? So the person climbing in the elevator with you, they looked you in the eye and they said, what do you think your gifts are for? And you had this conversation, and see, I'd already given you the answer. I don't always do that. But sharing is caring. Your gifts have a purpose, and we're going to explore that right now. You know, when I was in college, and B.A. Baracus, or Mr. T, was still a public character, and there was this little index card I had that I love to give to people, and it said, you are special because God don't make no junk. Some of you are special because God don't make no junk. And it's the underlying principle here. So what are your gifts for then? There's something that's going to be on the other side of it. But like our possessions, like our time, like our internal thoughts and our passions, I think that we can approach our gifts from kind of three positions. I want to lay them out real quick. They're not like universally accepted, but there's hoarders, There's keepers and there's stewards. And this is the way we approach life. And there's reasons behind each one. So we find when it comes to gifting, if you want to wonder, and here's what I've realized about myself. Sometimes I hoard my gifts. Sometimes I keep my gifts. And sometimes I steward my gifts. So on any given day, I can do all three. So these are not like monolithic buckets that you are just this. We can bounce in and out of these things. But as a hoarder of my gifts, I can tend to have this overly emotional connection to my gifts, which leads to a fear that if I express my gifts, what if they're not received by others and I'm rejected? And so we can find ourselves that hoarders can tend to hide. It's really important, I don't want to universally say this is just what we're like. Hoarders tend to hide their gifts. They tend to keep them in because the risk of sharing them with others is too high. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. How you were raised, some things you experienced at pivotal points in your life, or there was times when you were in a group and you thought, maybe I do have a gift to share, and you tried to share it and it was just put right back in your face. And you remember the difficult pain of that moment and you go, no, you know what? I'm going to hide my gifts. That way, I'll never be rejected. No one will ever be able to say whether or not I have blessed them with this or that because I keep it in. So hoarders tend to hide. But then there's keepers, and keepers are a little different than hoarders. Keepers tend to keep. So when I'm keeping my gifts, the main recipient of my gifts is me. I'm looking at it as a resource. And I'm going, how can I leverage this resource and keep it for my own good? And so that might be a way that can play out for a lot of adults is you go to work and you actually have competencies and gifts and skills that bless people. And then you come home from work and you just shut that off and you're like, well, I don't get a paycheck for this. So, I mean, you want to see the gift, you got to pay me. And so you can find keepers can tend to keep. But then this is where it gets real important, where our growth is. Stewards tend to share. And steward is a word I want to explore with you real quick, and then we're going to see a whole community of stewards sharing and what that looks like in their gifting. So think back to this list, and whatever word you grabbed hold of. You said, okay, it's my experiment. I'm going to say that my gift is in management, so I'm good at leading other people towards a common cause, or my gift is entrepreneurial and people, I'm always starting up new things. And you're holding that idea, and you're wondering, did God make me this way? And why did he make me this way? Well, you can hoard that gift. You can hide it because the fear of what will happen if you share it. You can keep that gift. You can hone it and train it up and shine it up and leverage it for as much personal benefit as possible. Or you can steward that gift. Sharing is caring. Steward is a word that shows up around the church and life a lot, but we need to give it some definition. To be a steward is to be a curator or a manager. So there's this key idea that we'll find in just a moment. It's that ownership, placing ownership properly is really important. That your gifts belong to God. He has given them to you, and he wants you to curate or manage them. He said, here's a ton of art, put it up for people to see, but you didn't paint it. Just put it out there. Manage it well. Let people see it. Let people explore and see what it's like. And so Peter, a follower of Jesus, and he's writing letters to the early church, and he's trying to explain to them, like, this is how we're going to live. And you'll see, he never directly says, like gift. He just kind of gives a picture of what a community who is stewarding their gifts look like. I want to take you to that. It's 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 8. There weren't chapters and verses. Again, when Peter wrote this, it was just a letter. And here's a portion of this letter. So Peter says, I think this is such a compelling picture. He says, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. And that's really interesting. You think about that. Like, I can totally relate to that. Like, there's times you offer hospitality and you're like, oh, I just wish they weren't in town. I got so much going on. And so this is not, apparently it's not just an us issue. This is like a thing way back then. People are struggling with this. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. You can start to see this hoarding, keeping, stewarding principle at play. Peter goes on, he says, each of you should use whatever gift you've received to serve others as faithful stewards, curators, or managers. It's an ownership word, and that ownership word, it's not just a technicality. Everything springboards off of it. My gifts are something I've received from a kind, generous God. And there's no person in this room who has not, your gifts may not be on display like others, but there is no person in this room who has not received gifts from a kind, loving, generous God. And he's given them to you, not to build you up or not to store them away, but to serve others as faithful managers of those gifts. And he says, as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. And then he gets a little practical. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. And you might feel like ancient text, I guess there's some good principles I can apply, but I'm looking at some of you who are here with me last night as we celebrated the life of Justin Smith, one of our teenage students who died earlier this month. And I think about that moment. Do you know, some of you out here, your gifts were used to encourage and to serve in a place that none of us wanted to be encouraging and serving, but we were invited into. And I realized this reality, they should do so with the strength God provides. Me and my role, when you get in a situation like that affects our community, affects our Southeast Boise community, affects my own heart, I don't have the strength to be good with my gifts. But do you know who does have the strength? God does. And so they should do so with the strength God provides. And in a practical way, I just want to say thank you to this community for stepping forward with the strength God provides. And it will be needed again in days and weeks and months ahead to love a family that's going through such great loss. This is on the ground living. This is not inspirational poetry. It's a great tattoo if you want to get it, but it's more than that. This is life. And he goes on and he ends with this. Talking about that. Okay, so he ends here, actually. And now, so Peter catch your breath, I'll catch mine. Peter is writing to the church. But this church formed, and we experienced the formation of it in the book of Acts, ACTS, chapter 2. It tells us about the formation of this church. As Peter's saying, here's how you live, here's what you should do. So I want to read it to you now so you can hear. Again, you don't hear an explicit statement of use your gift this way. You're technical, do this, fix the faucet, whatever. What you're going to find is a story of people who are stewarding their lives. It's Acts chapter 2. I'm going to read it to you, and then we'll put it on the screen afterwards. So this is the church. They, as the first church, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the breaking of bread and prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold their property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their numbers daily those who were being saved. And so here's this picture, this story of the very first church, and it's kind of Peter's talking, and here we are 2,000 years later, like this is a church. We're in the same kind of conversation. All the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper. So as an early practice in the church, they would eat together all the time. And I always hear stories where someone says, I showed up at your church and I was nervous. I wasn't sure if I was going to be welcomed or accepted. And then someone invited me to lunch. Or later on, a couple weeks in, they asked me to want to come over and have dinner with them. And it's amazing how sharing a meal can be a game changer for someone who feels isolated, who feels like they don't belong. It's a great habit for all of us to practice. And so you find the believers are devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. And this word devoted is fantastic because so often we would think belief is like, you almost would think all the believers agreed in their minds with the stuff they believed. But belief is an action that affects how we think, how we love, how we hate or how we don't hate, what we do with our time, our energy, our talents, our resources, where our gifts fit in our day-to-day living. All the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to being together, and to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. And so right away as we jump into this, I just see a few principles I want to point out to you. And the first is this. When it comes to how we figure out how to share our gifts, our calling is to live life together. You see it from the beginning. We know it's the best way to do things, but it's so hard because there's so much cultural and life pressure pushing us apart. There's shame we have in our stories. There's things we're not sure how to talk about. There's ways we don't want to intrude on other people's lives. And so the temptation to not do life together is real. But we find right away this group of stewards of their gifts came together and they lived out their calling. And calling's it's an important word in this sentence right here. Because calling means that there's like a voice you hear and you want to go near it. You want to draw towards it. So we want to be drawn towards living life together. It's how the early church started. Seth Godin says, fantastic marketer. I'm not very good at applying any of his principles, but listen to what he says. It's very similar. Remarkable individuals recognize that their mission is to engage in the meaningful act of living life in the company of others. Don't you want to be remarkable? Isn't it great when remarkable individuals don't have to have a certain physique? They don't have to be able to run a certain speed. They don't have to have a certain intellect or earn a certain paycheck or own a certain home or drive a certain car. Remarkable individuals recognize that their mission is to engage in the meaningful act of living life in the company of others. And so we start, our calling is to live life in community. This doesn't naturally happen to us, and we'll get to that in just a second. So then the book of Acts, Luke continues to tell us the story that he observed and eventually became his story as he writes it down. And Luke says, a deep sense of awe came over them all, and the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders. And all the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. This is a wild picture. All the believers, they were meeting together in one place and they shared everything they had. And then it gets intense. They sold their property and possessions and they shared the money with those in need. They worshiped together at the temple each day. They met in homes for the Lord's Supper. This was remembering the last meal Jesus shared with his friends when he said, eat this bread and drink this wine and do so in remembrance of me, of the good gift you've been given. So they reminded themselves of this regularly. So they met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and they shared their meals with great joy and generosity. Now, first I want to take like a Bible note. Okay, so it's challenging. Reading the Bible can be really challenging because one of the things that happens is we might take, and you and I can be in this boat, we might take one of three challenging positions that can lead us to some difficult outcomes. And one of them can be being like, this is a theological like dictionary and encyclopedia. It's just supposed to teach me how to say stuff about God. While that is true, that is not the purpose of the scriptures, and it will take you down a really odd path if you just are like theology textbook right here. Most of us will never read it because we'll go, I can't do theology. And then there's others of us that will go, yeah, but it's not that. This is actually like the moral code. All you need to do is open it, and like it'll tell you what to do in any situation. Try that. You will end up being like, oh, not doing that. Okay? Because it's not, now a picture of flourishing human living and why God applies morality and boundaries to our lives, it's in here, and it's rich and it's full, and it invites us to live, but that's not, you can end up with poor outcomes. So if you read this as a moral code, what do you walk away from this text saying? All right, shame on you all. You all probably have houses, right? And you drove a car here today. What's wrong with you? Don't you love God? Go sell these things and give it all away. Now, and be really careful though. This is still a beautiful picture of what a life in Christ invites us into. Stewarding things, not owning them, sharing them, giving them up to those in need. Like there's a picture here. But this church sold everything they had. Then there was a famine. Then they were very poor and on the brink of starvation. And another church in the area of Macedonia who had never met them sent them offerings to help them buy food and put roofs over their head. And you start to see this picture of how this like living in community works. Because but we have to be careful when we look at this. Because if it's a moral handbook, then we all are missing the mark. But there's still a challenge in here. The other risk we take is this. We kind of read the Bible as a devotional like guidebook. Or sort of, I just want to get a nugget. I just want to read that nugget. It's going to take me through my day. And then you kind of like, you're like, all right. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Maybe there's a nugget for you in that, but that's actually a psalm of ascent written to the people of Israel on their way to Jerusalem. There's some history and some scholarship in there. And so we want to avoid theological textbook, we want to avoid moral handbook, and we want to avoid just like devotional grab bag. So what do we do with the Bible? Well, it's a unified story. It's the Word of God. And I'm stealing this from a group called the Bible Project. It's a unified story that points to Christ. So the picture that we see here is the inspired word of God telling us a unified story of what following Jesus looks like when you're in community. All right, so with that out of the way, some of us could leave this going, what am I supposed to do with all that, selling everything? The bottom line, though, is we're going to see this. A life following Jesus is a life of radical generosity, all the way down to your gifts. Because the story continues on, where I just highlight a different part. Look at the outcome of the way they lived. And they shared their meals, and they were marked by joy and generosity. They were marked by joy and generosity. And what I see when you get this picture of this early church meeting, sharing their possessions, eating together, making room in their homes for one another, worshiping together commonly, is I just see this picture that our calling is to pass it on. Our calling is to be stewards, not to be hoarders and not to be keepers, but to be stewards of the gift we have received. You know, Jesus said this little line when he was talking to his close followers. He sent them out to tell people about the good news. And he said, freely you have received, freely give. And that sentence only works because it uses freely twice. Freely you have received. And because what you have received was free, you don't need to hoard it. You don't need to keep it. You can just freely give it. And you can trust that if you need to receive again, you will, and you'll just give. And if you take freely out of that sentence, it breaks down on a very practical level. So Jesus is looking out. He's saying, I want to teach you how this is going to work. Freely you have received. Freely give. Our calling is to pass it on. Sharing is caring. One of my favorite authors says this. I'm not going to put it on the screen. I just want you to hear it. He says, indeed, my dear friends, we are but stewards of the gifts we have been granted. And it is our responsibility to share them with our fellow beings so that we may journey together toward a brighter tomorrow. Like, you want a brighter tomorrow? I know I do. That we might journey together toward a brighter tomorrow. That's C.S. Lewis, just talking about life and how it is to be lived. So we have these pictures that our calling is to be in community. Our calling is to pass it on. And then this short text describing the early church ends this way. All the while, these people were praising God and enjoying the goodwill of all the people. And each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. If you read the Bible, you know it does not shy away from telling you uncomfortable moments in the story of the church or the story of God's people. So this is interesting that Luke says, all the while they're praising God, enjoying goodwill of all the people. It seems like the community in Jerusalem was like, we are so thankful these Christian people are here. We're so thankful. They live in community and they're helping one another, not just one another. They're so willing to give away that they're helping the least of our city. They're with them too. And when famine breaks out and when fires break out and when war breaks out and when disease breaks out, they just hang around and they continue their sharing habits. And what we see is each day the Lord adds to their fellowship those who are being saved. And so I see this third principle. It's just this. The outcome of living in community and the outcome of passing it on is transformation and multiplication. There's two things that happen. People's hearts are changed, and their community grows. Their community grows with people who say, I just want more of that. I want more of that in my life, and I want to give more of that away. I want to freely keep receiving, and I want to freely give. And so we give freely of our talents and our abilities, and it creates this ripple effect that multiplies and impacts lives of others in incredible ways. I'm the result of this. A community that freely gave welcomed me in. My heart was transformed and I got to experience like growth and multiplication as other people were impacted. So many of you in this room, this is your story. Somebody in a community somewhere invested in you. They showed you that you had purpose and that you had a community, and they invited you in and your heart was transformed. And then you became part of multiplication. This is a very real human story. Some of you, you're like, I don't know, as a Christian since I was a baby, I can't think of any time, but your story's been this. Through being held in the nursery and loved in the preschool and cared for in kid mission and part of the junior high and the high school and being allowed to ask your questions and wrestle with your faith, you've reached this place where you go, you know what? I'm experiencing transformation. I'm becoming more like Jesus. I'm living in community, and I'm freely giving what I freely received. And the outcome is multiplication. This is really important because there's just a few things I want to take away as we go, maybe challenges for you. And the first is this, they're choices. This is all just a story that we can reject if we want to, because it happened to a little group of people 2,000 years ago. But what if what they experience is the very thing you and I are longing for every day? It's the very thing we're clawing for and scratching for and working for and fighting for. It's the very thing that's weighing on our shoulders as we just look at what really is an epidemic of mental health that's oppressing us as we look at our lives and we go, man, it's just wild. Things are so hard right now and my anxiety level's through the roof, and I know it shouldn't feel that way, but it does. And I'm not saying, and just do this and it goes away, because that's not how it works. But life is pretty good. And it's as hard as ever. And I scratch my head and I go, why? What's missing? And I want to give you 3 things to think about. Maybe if we align and choose a way of living where our gifts are commonly shared for the good of others, it might just change the conversation. Create a more healthy conversation, create a space where we can have hard conversations. And so the 3 things are just this. I think we need to choose community over isolation. That's what we saw. This group of Christians came together and they said, we're going to share meals together. Life groups is just a program for that. You can do it without life groups. We're going to share meals together. We're going to share story together. We're going to struggle together. We're going to share our gifts together. Someone has a need, we're going to step in and we're going to offer to satisfy that need out of our giftings. We choose community over isolation. And this one's really tricky because we are more like connected than ever, like information, right? Digital connection, technology, the algorithm. I'm going to pick on it for just a minute with no technical skills to talk about it. The algorithm gives you and me the impression that we are in community, because it surrounds us with people who think like us, talk like us, and agree with what we agree with. But it's done one thing in that process that is incredibly unhealthy for human flourishing. It has isolated us from everybody else. So it drives us into, look, I have my community of people. We're high-fiving constantly. We're so smart and brilliant. Why doesn't everybody just follow us? And there's a dozen other communities saying the same thing, because a technical algorithm is driving us into isolation on our phones and our computers constantly. So we, more than ever, have a choice. If you only come today, please just walk away with this. If you think I'm crazy, just this one thing I'm not crazy on. That was not funny. Choose community over isolation, and that is going to take some radical thinking about how we live with the devices in our pockets. Choose community over isolation. Let's remove those devices. It's already a challenge, right? So it's already a challenge. So this is the first step we see in this early church. They willingly chose to give it away by being in community and saying, I'm not going to be isolated. Choose community over isolation. The second thing is this: choose generosity over scarcity. And it's crazy to me. So in my life right now, I have more than I have ever had. And I probably worry more than I ever have about not having enough. Interesting principle. I've talked a little bit about growing up poor. I was in a situation that was difficult. We didn't always know where food was going to come from. There was a season, talked about this, where my mom was a cleaner of vacation homes, and we'd stay in those homes when the owners were gone. That's just how we made it work. It's a short season, but that's the type of income we were wrestling with, okay? So as I went to college and I got a job, I'm like, you know what? I'm never going to have scarcity, and my kids are never going to experience scarcity. And we have more than ever, and I still feel like I just need a little more. Do you resonate with that? Just need a little more? You know what a little more is going to give each of us? Just a little more desire to have a little more. So we find in this church, they practice giving it away. Not just, we're talking about gifts right now. So if you went to money, pull back. The best thing about you is you, it's not your stuff. And they practice the hardest thing, actually giving themselves away. It's easier to give your stuff away. They start practice giving themselves, they chose generosity over scarcity day one. And that might be a reason people looked up and said, tell me again about this Jesus. Well, what was he like? What did he do? Who was he? You say he's God. You say he died for sin, was buried dead, and rose from the dead, and death can't hold us now that we're not defined by the worst thing. Tell me more, because they see a life of generosity over a life of scarcity. That's got to be the mark of our church. It should be the mark of our personal lives. And the last thing is this, choosing expansion over reduction. And this is the tricky part, because I find for myself, I've been here 3 years. I like this church. I like you. I get to know your names. And then more of you come. There's some faces I don't recognize. I'm like, expansion makes everything so difficult. Now this service isn't terrible. Last service, the last 3 weeks has been nuts. Someone sat in your seat. You had to wait like 2 or 3 people to get coffee. The kids' room was crazy. You guys are serving in the kids' room. There's like 18 preschoolers in there. Let's reduce things. Reduction feels safe. Reduction feels controllable. Reduction feels well-defined and like I know, but here's the thing. Reduction leads us to hoarding and keeping our gifts. Only using and giving as much as we need to keep things where we can thrive. But what if our place to thrive is being in community over isolation, is embracing generosity over scarcity, and is ultimately understanding that there's an expansion that happens when you do that, and in a very, a trite way, someone will sit in your seat. You just have to find a new one, or maybe not have one at all because you can't wait for someone to have that spot, because expansion happens. But I don't just mean in a church growth mindset. I actually mean expansion happens in our hearts. We begin to see the world as God's world and to see our gifts as God's gifts. And we can't wait to give them away, because freely we have received, so freely we give. Freely we give. So I'm just going to give you a way to think about this before we sing our closing song. Acts chapter 2 gives me a picture that this is healthy living. Community over isolation. Generosity greater than scarcity. Expansion greater than reduction. So maybe this week, with Monday coming, all right? Maybe this week, you look at one of these and you go, you know what, actually, we really have chosen community. We're experiencing it, but boy, we're still living in scarcity. And that's where we need to do our work. We need to believe that God is big enough to give us enough to live the life that we're called to live. Or maybe it's down here, you just find yourself reducing. And reducing happens over time. You just decide over time, you have an interaction with a few different people, and you go, I don't like people like that. And now you just write them off. You bump into that person in a setting, and you're like, I'm not even going to bother with that person because I know what those people are like. And when that starts to become how we think, we are reducing things. No one's those people and what they're like. Everyone's more beautiful and complex and complicated, and their pain is more real and their hope is more real. So expansion keeps us at this deeply human level where we reject the algorithm and we lean into human living, okay? So 3 things. You can look at each one. I would love for you to go, this week, I just want more community. I'm going to choose it. I'm going to ask hard questions about it. I'm going to lean into it. Or this week, I'm going to be more generous. I'm tired of living from a scarcity mindset. It's going to start at work tomorrow. That's how it's going to happen. Or you know what? I'm going to start embracing expansion. I want to see more. I don't know what the more is, but I want to see more. I want to be more open to people, my neighbors, my friends. Maybe it's family you've disconnected with. I'm going to believe that reducing a reductionary life doesn't actually give me the flourishing hope that I long for. So I'll put this up. Do me a favor. Ask God which one he can't wait to give you more of. Which one he's just right here saying, I can't wait to give you this gift. Just have a conversation with God. Pray about this. And we'll just give you a minute, and then we'll sing a closing song.
When you try your best but don't succeed, when you get what you want, not what you need, when you feel so tired but you can't sleep, stuck in reverse, and the tears come streaming down your face.